Some months ago, the world was thrown into a frenzy when the Titan submersible that was traveling to the Titanic wreckage imploded, killing all 5 persons on board. What happens when that dream voyage or cruise suddenly becomes a nightmare? Today, we're going to the dark side of maritime history to reveal the deadliest cruise ship disasters in the world. From the tragic fate of the Titanic that claimed up to 1,500 lives, to the MV Dona Paz that took the body count to a whopping 4,000. This is not to scare you from sea travel, but that's not even close to the worst cruise ship disaster we've got on our list. Trust me, you do want to stick around for that one. When we talk about cruise ship disasters, one name rings a bell in our head for sure: the RMS Titanic. A popular Hollywood blockbuster movie was even made in its name. The Titanic would remain etched in our memories as one of the worst cruise ship disasters in the history of mankind. The date, April 15, 1912, will forever be remembered for this infamous maritime disaster. The RMS Titanic was not just a ship, it was more like a moving hotel, an incredible piece of engineering that embodied the 20th century's achievements. It was 882 feet long and 175 feet high, and was the largest ship to be built at its construction. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments. Some people even thought the ship was unsinkable. Let's take you back to April 14, 1912. It was a calm night, and everything seemed to be all well and good as the Titanic was cruising on its first voyage. Or so they thought. On board, passengers were living a high life and could not have known that danger would befall them in the near future. Despite the several iceberg warnings relayed throughout the day, the ship continued to move ahead at an almost maximum speed. After all, this was the Titanic, the most incredible boat ever created at that time. What could possibly happen? But then, at 11:40 p.m., the unexpected occurred. One of the lookouts, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg directly in the path of the ship. The commanding officer immediately tried to pull off some maneuvers, but it was all to no avail, as it would appear that it was the destiny of the ship to be devoured by the merciless sea. It all happened in a matter of seconds. You really can't blame the captain at that point, can you? What stunt could you possibly pull off to avert a collision that was only about 37 seconds ahead? The iceberg struck the right side of the Titanic and cut through the ship just as a hot knife goes through butter. In minutes, water poured in and began to fill 5 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. Water penetrating these compartments made letting out the water equally impossible, and in no time it began to spread into others as well. The very design that was intended to shield the ship ensured and led to its destruction. The Titanic began to sink gradually, giving the crew and passengers only 2 hours and 40 minutes to evacuate. Fears began to spread among the crew members as they came to the realization of what was happening very quickly. The process of evacuation became a complete mess. The 20 lifeboats that were available on the ship could only hold about half of the 2,209 persons present on the ship. Knowing this, the evacuation process became chaotic because, who wants to die? The policy of women and children first was then adopted, and although well-intentioned, only caused more disorder and ineffectiveness. The confusion during the evacuation resulted in many lifeboats being swung or dropped into the water or made unusable. Ultimately, only 706 passengers were secured in these lifeboats. As for the rest of the passengers, what happened to them? Well, let's just say that's why it's called a tragedy. Over 1,500 passengers died within minutes in the water, even with the life jackets on them due to hypothermia. Talk about freezing to death. The water was icy and people died within minutes due to hypothermia. Only a few were spared to recount the story. If you thought the Titanic was the worst ship disaster, then you might want to hold that thought, because the MV Dona Paz is about to rewrite that narrative. This catastrophic event, often referred to as the Titanic of Asia, happened in the calm waters of the Philippines on a seemingly routine night in December 1987. But this tragedy, it claimed even more lives than the Titanic. Hard to imagine, right? The MV Dona Paz An inter-island passenger ferry was in its normal operation on the night of December 20, 1987, from Leyte Island to Manila. The ship, meant to accommodate 1,518 people, was overloaded with people, and it was estimated that there were more than 4,000 people on board, most of whom were unaccounted for in the manifest. It was a ticking time bomb waiting for the right time to explode, and nobody could have imagined how disastrous the trip would be. While the ship was passing through the Tablas Strait, an oil tanker, the MT Vector, carrying more than 8,800 barrels of petroleum products and gasoline on board, was sighted in the dead of night. Unfortunately, the two ships collided with each other. The force of the impact was very great and caused the petroleum cargo, which was in the MT Vector, to explode almost immediately. The fire quickly spread through the Dona Paz, transforming the vessel into a floating pyre in minutes. The fire raged on with such intensity, and the Dona Paz, which was constructed mainly of wood and other flammable materials, quickly caught fire. There was chaos when the passengers, many of whom were fast asleep, woke up to the sound of the impact and the sight of the burning fire. There was no chance of escape and almost no protection for the passengers. There were no life jackets and many lifeboats were non-functional. A lot of people, in a bid to escape from the burning vessel, leaped into the water, but escape wasn't easy. The oil floating on the water had caught fire, leaving those who jumped in trapped between two options of death: the flames and shark-infested waters. Survivors spoke of swimming through charred bodies and using anything they could find as makeshift flotation devices. It was a nightmare beyond imagination. Within 2 hours, the Dona Paz sank, dragging most of its passengers to a watery grave. Rescue came, but far too late. Out of over 4,000 people, only 26 survived, 24 passengers and 2 crew from the Vector. The tragedy left the world stunned and raised questions that were never fully answered. How could a ferry be so overloaded? Or better yet, couldn't the collision have been avoided? We may never know all the answers. The MV Dona Paz disaster recorded a staggering death toll of over 4,000, making it one of the worst disasters in history. July 24, 1915 was a day of festivity, happiness, and music. The annual picnic of thousands of employees of the Western Electric Company was about to begin. Music was blasting, everyone was excited, and families, all well-dressed for Sunday church, started to embark on the SS Eastland, one of 5 steamers that would transport them to the shores of Lake Michigan. Little did they know that they were embarking on a journey of no return. The Eastland was first launched in 1903 to transport 650 passengers. Over the years, it went from retrofitting to questionable upgrades that boosted the capacity to 2,500 people. It was on record that engineers and naval architects had pointed out the problems with the ship's design. Unfortunately, nothing was done to deal with those problems. As the passengers continued to board that morning, the Eastland began to show signs of trouble. The ship, notorious for usually tilting from side to side, started to tilt under the weight of the crowd. Some reports suggest that passengers were leaning to one side, possibly to take photographs, while others point to overloading as the primary issue. In a desperate attempt to stabilize the vessel, the ship's engineer, Joseph Eriksson, opened a ballast tank to allow water in, hoping to balance the boat. But it was too late. Within moments, the unthinkable happened. Right there at the Chicago River's edge, the SS Eastland began to tilt. Slowly at first, and then suddenly overturned into the river. Passengers screamed as the ship heaved to its side and capsized. Hundreds were thrown into the murky waters, while others were trapped beneath the ship, desperately trying to escape. Rescue efforts were frantic but chaotic. Divers cut through the hull of the ship to reach survivors trapped inside, and about 40 people were miraculously pulled out alive. But for over 800 others, it was too late. The river became a graveyard, with bodies so numerous that nets were used to prevent them from floating out into Lake Michigan. So what caused this devastating accident? Experts believe it was a deadly combination of design flaws and poor construction, with an overloaded ship and inadequate ballast tanks sealing the passengers' fate. But that's not all. The shipbuilders, Jenks Shipbuilding Company, were used to making freighters, not passenger vessels. So was this tragedy doomed to happen from the start? The SS Eastland disaster claimed 844 lives, leaving an indelible scar on Chicago's history. Despite the staggering loss of life, lawsuits against the ship's owners were dismissed, and the exact cause of the disaster remains a subject of debate. On September 27, 1994, the Estonia, a massive ferry carrying nearly 1,000 people, set off on a voyage from Tallinn, Estonia, to Stockholm, Sweden. It was supposed to be a smooth overnight journey, the kind that thousands of people had made before. But that night, the Baltic Sea had something else in mind. The ship left port just after 7 p.m., slightly behind schedule, but nothing alarming. The passengers settled in for what they expected to be a peaceful night at sea. Most were Swedish, with a fair number of Estonians on board, along with a crew tasked with navigating the turbulent autumn waters. The weather wasn't unusual for the Baltic, rough winds and high waves, but nothing the Estonia couldn't handle, or so everyone thought. But as midnight approached, something felt off. A loud metallic bang echoed throughout the ship. Was it just the sound of the waves slamming against the bow, or was it something more? That question was answered quickly as a series of bangs followed. The crew checked the visor at the front of the ship, which secured the ramp to the car deck, and everything seemed fine, or so it appeared. Then, at around 1:00 a.m., disaster struck. In a moment of horror, the bow visor ripped away from the ship, exposing the car deck to the ferocious Baltic waters. It happened fast. Water surged into the ship, flooding the car deck, and the Estonia began to tilt sharply to the side. The ship, which just moments ago seemed unsinkable, was now leaning, taking on water and sliding towards catastrophe. Inside, panic spread. Passengers scrambled to reach the upper decks, but many were trapped as water flooded in faster than anyone could have imagined. The Estonia's list became steeper, and within 15 minutes, the situation turned from bad to fatal. The ship's engines failed. Communications cut out. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. Those who made it to the surface faced another grim challenge: the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea. By 1:50 a.m., less than an hour after the first bang, the MS Estonia had vanished from the radar screens. The ship was gone, swallowed by the sea, leaving nothing but darkness and debris in its wake. A mayday signal had been sent, but it was too late. The ship's rapid tilting and sinking prevented many from reaching safety. For those left stranded in the freezing water, hypothermia set in quickly. Rescue efforts were hindered by the stormy weather, and the first vessel to arrive, the Mariella, reached the scene at 2:12 a.m., but by then it was a scene of unimaginable devastation. Helicopters arrived later, pulling survivors from the life rafts, but the numbers were grim. Of the 989 passengers and crew on board, only 138 survived. Hundreds perished in the water as over 600 were trapped inside the ship when it sank. In 2021, underwater robots explored the site and found a massive hole in the hull of the ship, which sparked more controversies regarding the actual cause of the tragedy. Nevertheless, the sinking of Estonia is still a vivid example of how life can be unpredictable at sea and how an ordinary ferry trip can become one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. May 7, 1915 was a fateful day in maritime history. The British ocean liner RMS Lusitania, famous for its speed and comfort, was sunk. Leaving New York and approaching the port of Liverpool, the Lusitania had 1,952 passengers and crew members on board. The RMS Lusitania was a Cunard-Line ship launched in 1906 and considered one of Britain's most advanced naval technologies. It was 787 feet long, weighed over 44,000 tons, was the fastest passenger ship of its time, and was built for luxury and speed. However, as the First World War unfolded, the oceanic conditions of the Atlantic started getting more dangerous because of the German U-boats that had started practicing unrestricted warfare. Captain William Turner ignored the warning from the British Admiralty and proceeded with the journey, believing that the ship's speed would help it avoid any trouble. However, at about 2:10 p.m. in the Irish Sea, a German U-boat, U-20, fired a torpedo that exploded on the side of the Lusitania. The first blast was very severe, and the second blast was even more severe, which led to the sinking of the ship. Within 18 minutes, the Lusitania was sunk and 1,198 people died. 128 of them were Americans. The confusion during the evacuation resulted in many lifeboats being swung or dropped into the water or made unusable due to the ship's severe state. Some survivors floated on the wreckage in the icy water, and the rescue operations tried to get to the affected ones. Have you heard of stories where a captain escapes from a sinking ship, leaving behind the passengers on board to die? Well, this story is one. The Costa Concordia, incorporated in 2006, was one of the most popular cruise ships of the Costa Cruises. Stretching almost 1,000 feet long and equipped with restaurants, theaters, and swimming pools, it provided anything a passenger could wish for. However, the 13th of January 2012 turned out to be a day of misfortune for the cruise ship and for those on board. On that ill-fated night, the ship's captain, Francesco Schettino, made a very grave mistake when he gave an order to perform a maneuver called salute to the tiny island of Giglio by steering the ship dangerously close to shore. This was to attract the people's attention on the island and impress them, but this proved to be a fatal decision and the biggest mistake Schettino ever made. At 9:45 p.m. that day, the ship hit an underwater rock which caused the hull of the Costa Concordia to strike the side of the ship and create an opening of 160 feet. Water entered the vessel and it tilted to one side rather steeply. People panicked as the lights went off and the vessel started to lean. People, most of whom were having their meals or resting in their staterooms, were thrown into confusion. However, the evacuation was delayed even though the situation was critical. Schettino, the commanding officer, hesitated to give the command, and when he did, the staff was not in a position to handle the situation. Boats could not be launched because the ship was tilting to one side, and people were in search of how to get off the ship. There was no order in the system, and the communication that took place was not very clear either. Finally, the Costa Concordia tilted over and sank, and now lies on its side in relatively shallow waters off the island. The disaster cost the lives of 32 people, and thousands of others were left with emotional and psychological shock. The consequences uncovered many reckless actions and negligence that resulted in Captain Schettino's arrest and subsequent conviction on several charges, including manslaughter. The Costa Concordia disaster is still fresh in people's memories as a vivid example of how a moment of fun can turn into a tragedy due to human mistakes. The most gruesome event on our list, the sinking of the Wilhem Gustlof, took place on January 30, 1945. With a death toll of nearly 9,000, this tragedy far surpasses the much-publicized Titanic disaster, making it the worst cruise ship disaster ever recorded in the history books. When the Wilhem Gustlof was initially launched in 1937, it served as a cruise ship for the Nazis' Kraft durch Freude, or in English, Strength Through Joy program. But as the World War invaded Europe, the ship's fate was changed altogether. In the last months of World War II, on the 30th of January 1945, the Gustlof became involved in Operation Hannibal, which was the evacuation of thousands of German soldiers, civilians, and refugees. Filled with over 10,000 plus passengers, far more than its carrying capacity, the Wilhem Gustlof set off from Gotenhafen, now known as Gdynia in Poland, for Kiel in Germany. Everyone on board was expecting to escape the war. Little did they know they were heading to one of the worst war disasters. At 9:00 p.m., the Soviet submarine S-13 fired 3 torpedoes, which struck the ship with considerable precision. The Gustlof capsized in 90 minutes and its passengers were thrown into the freezing water of the Baltic Sea. More than 9,000 people died, most of them women and children, and the scale of the tragedy was unparalleled. However, the tragedy did not attract much attention from the general public, as the Nazis tried to keep the information a secret and the war overshadowed everything else. The sinking of Wilhem Gustlof is a very sad story of the massive loss of life during the war, which is even more than that of the Titanic and is regarded as the biggest shipping disaster in the world, forever marking it as a grim symbol of the immense suffering and loss experienced during wartime. Yeah, I hope you've learned a thing or two from today's video. If you have, give the video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Remember to click the notification bell so that you can be updated always when we are posting the next episode as we move forward to unveil more interesting history.